The Polish Eagles of the Battle of Britain, the vengeance in the skies, the hidden impact of Polish fighter pilots on the Battle of Britain. Hi everyone and welcome back to Jaxom Talks. August 1940, the Battle of Britain rages. The fate of democracy hangs quite literally in the air. The British Royal Air Force, the RAF, is outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of pilots. Every fighter squadron is pushed past breaking point, day after grueling day, defending an island that stands alone against the might of the Third Reich. When we talk about the few, as immortalized by Churchill as heroes, we usually picture the stoic young men of England, Scotland, Wales, and the Commonwealth. And that image is absolutely correct. They were magnificent. But in the thick of the fighting, flying hurricanes and Spitfires with a devastating ferocity the British had rarely seen was an additional group that have slipped from history. A brotherhood of exiles. They spoke Polish. They prayed for a country they knew they might never see again. And they flew with a cold, almost surgical vengeance that would redefine the fight. These were the Polish fighter pilots. For decades, their contribution was at best a footnote and at worst a deliberate erasure from the history books. Yet, statistically, historically, and psychologically, they were not just participants in the Battle of Britain. They were arguably the razor-thin margin between victory and invasion. This is the story of the Polish Eagles, the pilots who came to fight for the future of Britain because they had already lost their own past. To understand the intensity these pilots brought to the summer skies of 1940, we have to rewind to September 1939. While the British and French mobilized, Poland faced the full brutal force of the Blitzkrieg. It was a military revolution, armored spearheads, rapid air support, and total coordination. The Polish Air Force fought valiantly, inflicting losses, but they were overwhelmed. Then, just 17 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, signing Poland's death warrant. For the surviving Polish pilots, there was no surrender. There was only escape. Their fight was an odyssey of heartbreak. They fled across Romania, navigated occupied Europe, and often disguised themselves as civilians to reach France. They were not defectors. They were professional soldiers determined to continue the fight. They carried not just their uniforms, but the agonizing memory of watching their homeland burn. This loss was their fuel. In France, they reformed into squadrons, but the French Air Force, a great institution in its own right, was reluctant to fully integrate them. The Polish pilots were often forced to fly obsolete equipment or serve as ground crews. This infuriating inaction was another crucible that they had to endure. They knew how to fight the Germans. After all, they had seen its brutality up close. When France fell in June 1940, the nightmare repeated itself. But this time, the final destination was an island democracy across the Channel. Over 8,000 Polish airmen, soldiers, and sailors made their way to Britain, ready to fight for an ally that, while geographically separated, was their last hope. When they arrived, they were immediately faced with a new kind of battle: bureaucracy. The RAF was initially skeptical, even resistant, to integrating the Polish pilots. The prevailing attitude, particularly among higher command, was cautious and, in some corners, dismissive. First, the language barrier was formidable. Operational communication in the air vectoring, identifying targets, warning of threats is non-negotiable. It has to be in English. Second, the RAF had a specific, structured doctrine. They favored disciplined maneuvers, tactical formation flying, and adherence to strict combat procedures. They looked at the Polish Air Force's performance in 1939 as a brutal, street-level style of fighting born out of desperation and only saw recklessness. The Polish pilots, in turn, saw the methodical RAF approach as slow and restrictive. They viewed air combat not as a gentlemanly duel, but as a desperate brawl for survival. Third, there was a quiet, lingering belief in certain British circles that perhaps the Poles' swift defeat in 1939 meant their pilots were simply not up to the standard of the Luftwaffe or even the RAF, a tragic and deeply unfair assessment. It took the intervention of some key figures and the sheer desperation of the RAF's pilot shortage to finally break through the resistance. Slowly, 2 Polish manned fighter squadrons were formed, 302 Squadron and 303 Squadron. The formation of 303 Squadron in July 1940 was particularly critical. Initially, it was manned by Polish aircrew and commanded by British officers, squadron leader Og Kellett and Flight Lieutenant John Kent. This was to ensure adherence to RAF protocol and to manage communication. They were given Hurricane fighters, slightly older than the Spitfire, but rugged and well suited to the task. The British officers looked at the Poles, men who had fought across 3 countries in less than a year, men whose homes were gone and whose families were under the heel of the enemy. They knew these men were different, but even with the paperwork complete, the pilots were kept on training and readiness patrols through July and early August. The RAF brass wanted to ensure they were up to scratch. Fate, however, was about to deliver a brutal necessity that would override all protocol. By late August 1940, the Battle of Britain entered its most critical phase, known as the hardest day. The Luftwaffe shifted its strategy, focusing its devastating attacks not just on ports, but on the very nerve center of the RAF, the fighter airfields, radar stations, and sector operations rooms. On August 30, 1940, an incredible thing happened during a training flight. A group of Hurricanes from 303 Squadron, practicing formation flying, stumbled across a German bombing raid. Instinct took over. Before the British CO could order them back, the Polish pilots broke formation, dove headlong into the bombers' escort, and immediately shot down 6 enemy aircraft. It was a baptism by fire, and the results were undeniable. The attrition rate among the British and Commonwealth pilots was becoming unsustainable. A young pilot arriving at a squadron could expect to live for, on average, just 4 weeks. The RAF was losing men faster than it could train them. It was in this moment of crisis that 303 Squadron received the order. They were now fully operational. From that day forward, 303 Squadron, now fully unleashed, became a phenomenon. The statistics are staggering. Keep in mind that 303 Squadron entered the battle late, operating for just 42 days during the official campaign period. In those 42 days, 303 Squadron, the most successful unit in the entire battle, officially claimed 126 German aircraft shot down. That means, on average, they were shooting down 3 German planes per day. Compare this to the average British squadron's tally, which was impressive but often less than half of 303 Squadron's score over the same period. 303 Squadron's total was nearly a third higher than the next highest scoring squadron. The Polish pilots accounted for approximately 12% of the total enemy aircraft destroyed by fighter command during the critical period of the battle, and they did this while making up only 5% of the total pilots. Their success was led by aces who became legends overnight: Witold Obunovich, Joseph František, a Czech who flew with the Poles, and Jan Zumbok, known for his signature Donald Duck insignia on his Hurricane. These were not just numbers. These kills came at a time when every single loss inflicted on the Luftwaffe delayed an invasion, saved an airfield, or protected a radar station. They flew with a ruthless efficiency that earned them the respect and, eventually, the reliance of fighter command. The question isn't whether they were good. The question should be, why were they so much more effective? Their success was no accident. It was the convergence of superior training, devastating doctrine, and a unique psychological profile. Firstly, their training was exceptional. The Polish Air Force had heavily emphasized advanced tactical flying and aggressive gunnery training before the war, unlike the new RAF pilots, who only had limited hours in the air before being thrown into combat. The Polish veterans were masters of their craft. Secondly, the key difference was their doctrine of attack. The RAF doctrine, while brave and well-intentioned, often involved a more cautious, measured approach, a controlled burst, aiming for the vulnerable areas, and then quickly disengaging. They were protecting their planes and conserving their resources. The Polish pilots, they had no intention of conserving anything. They fought according to a brutal yet practical mantra: shoot to kill and shoot now. They often ignored the official range recommendations. They would fly straight into the enemy formation, engaging in head-on passes, a maneuver the British considered suicidal but which offered the fastest, most effective kill. Their favorite tactic was to get so close, so terrifyingly close, often within 50 yards, that they couldn't miss. It was often noted that the Polish aircraft returned riddled with holes, not from enemy fire, but from the debris of the enemy plane they had just destroyed at point-blank range. It was a style born of their experience in 1939. They knew that if you waited, if you hesitated, the enemy would overwhelm you. The only way to survive was to inflict the maximum possible damage in the minimum possible time. But even more powerful than doctrine was the psychology of the exile. Imagine being a pilot fighting for a country that is not your own, against an enemy that has annihilated yours. They had no retreat. There was no home airfield to go back to in Poland. They were fighting for the memory of a nation, and they saw every German bomber, every Messerschmitt 109, as a personal, physical reminder of that loss. This wasn't patriotism. It was a desperate quest for vengeance. It was personal. They fought not with the professional stoicism of the RAF, but with a passionate, desperate fury. As one Polish pilot famously said, "If I have to die, I prefer to take 2 Germans with me." This determination, this willingness to push past the limits of risk, gave them the essential combat edge when the RAF needed it most. Their arrival provided the injection of morale, skill, and sheer killing power that allowed the exhausted British units to stand down, regroup, and recover. The Battle of Britain was won by October 1940. The Polish squadron stayed, fighting with distinction through the rest of the war. But the true hidden impact of the Polish pilots is found not just in the skies over Kent, but in the years after the war. The debt Britain owed these men was immeasurable. They risked everything, suffered heavy casualties, and achieved extraordinary feats, with 303 Squadron leading the way. Yet, as the war drew to a close, a tragic geopolitical reality overshadowed their heroism. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, the Allied powers essentially ceded control of Poland to the Soviet sphere of influence. For the Polish pilots, this was an agonizing betrayal. They had fought the Luftwaffe to protect the West too. Find their home handed over to a different totalitarian regime. The new Soviet-controlled government in Poland viewed these Western-aligned airmen as enemies. They were offered safe return, but safe return meant imprisonment, interrogation, or execution. The vast majority chose exile. Here is the most shameful part of the story. When the Victory Parade was held in London in 1946, the Polish pilots of the RAF were not invited. Why, you ask? Well, because inviting the Free Polish Forces would have offended the Soviet Union. To appease Stalin, the men who saved Britain, the men were excluded from celebrating the victory they had helped secure. The pilots, now grounded and stateless, were forced to make new lives in Britain, Canada, and elsewhere. They took jobs as taxi drivers, factory workers, and engineers. Their combat records, their heroism, and their crucial role in the fight against fascism were, for diplomatic reasons, quietly minimized. They became the heroes that were forgotten. It wasn't until decades later, through quiet persistence and scholarship, that the records were truly examined and the full, undeniable scope of their contribution emerged. They were not reckless, as some initial critics charged. They were decisive. They were not foreigners, as some might have dismissed them. They were the embodiment of Allied unity fighting a common enemy with a ferocity few could match. The Battle of Britain remains a timeless story of resilience, courage, and triumph over impossible odds. But our memory of it must be complete. The Polish airmen were the cutting edge of fighter command at its most desperate hour. They came from a shattered land, flying under a foreign flag, propelled by the ultimate motivator, the unquenchable desire for justice. Their flight paths trace the shape of heroism. Their kill ratios tell the story of unparalleled skill, and their exclusion from the Victory Parade tells the chilling story of how political expediency can erase the most profound acts of sacrifice. Today, we honor the few, a universal title for every single soul who took to the sky during that summer of 1940. But let us commit to acknowledging the debt we owe to the Polish Eagles of 302 and 303 Squadrons. They fought for our freedom, even when their own was gone. They won a battle, and in doing so, they saved a world that would tragically, momentarily forget them. Let's ensure the story of the few who were forgotten must never be silenced again. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. Let me know in the comments below what other topics you would like me to cover. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next video.